Hi, everybody. Welcome to Scarlet on Stone Church here on Sunday afternoon. For some of you, it's Sunday evening. And I hope that today will be a little bit, well, normally when I do a study, when we get together on Sundays, I normally go for a little while, about sometimes an hour. Today we may go a little less today, just to kind of cover, because today's study is going to be an interesting one because it has to do with kings. And it has to do with specific names of kings and times and warrings between them. And so it's going to be a very interesting part of getting and diving into an incredible chapter, the book of Daniel, which is chapter 11. And so in chapter 11, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of get through and walk through the verses. And maybe if we're lucky, if we get through it, if God willing, we'll try to move our way close to verse 17. That's our goal. But we may end a little sooner. It doesn't matter either way how we end, because this theme will carry over in the next study, and then it will lead us to the climax of the end of chapter 11 and then leading us into chapter 12. Now, what we're going to learn about chapter 11 is that chapter 11 is very much in some kind of way similar to what we read back in chapter 7. So if you're with us in our study at chapter 7, you will know that in that particular chapter in Daniel, we have a panorama of the world empires, and it is focused on the Gentile world empires. It's focused on that aspect. In chapter 11, it's the same kind of thing, but the focus actually is from the perspective of Israel. And so Israel is going to be in the center of this. It will not be the subject, but it ends up being the geographical location where warring kings are going to be battling for supremacy within the panorama of the future. Now, chapter 11 is a very unique chapter because of all the chapters that exist in the Bible, or I should say even in Old Testament prophecy, Daniel 11 is extremely specific. So much so that it actually pinpoints accuracy to 100% of events that actually occurred in our history from our point of view, but from Daniel's point of view, we're still yet future. So much so that the critics of the Bible, critics of prophecy, critics of Christianity and Judaism have actually looked at Daniel 11 and said that this chapter is a fake, a forgery. It was not written by a man named Daniel. It was written by someone in the 1st century BC or in the early part of the 2nd century BC. And the reason why that is because most critics of the Bible, don't believe in God. They don't have any respect towards God. And therefore, the idea of the miraculous, the idea of prophecies that are being fulfilled, or the idea of having fulfillment of what God has said is not something they even think about. Number two, they believe by default, because of premise number one, that there is no God. They also believe that Daniel was a liar, that he actually was a guy living much closer to the events that he had already talked about. The events already occurred, and he passed it off as if somehow God was revealing these things to him long before the events occurred. So it is, in a sense, an insult against Daniel, and an insult, of course, and blasphemy against God and the critics' hearts and attitudes towards chapter 11. The fascinating thing about this, though, this is not a new problem. This has been going on for centuries. As a matter of fact, as early as the 3rd and 4th century, there was a critic named Porphyr, who was a critic of Daniel, who believed that Daniel 11 was so specific on its prophecies, there's no possible way in the world that this book could have been written in the 5th century or 6th century BC. And because of it, he looked at it as I said earlier, as a forgery, or as written by someone who claimed to live in the past, but actually was living after the events occurred. And unfortunately, throughout the Christian world, in the academic world, the liberal side of Christianity, they have taken these critiques and they've adopted them. And so as you are as we discuss these matters within Christendom, there are those on the liberal side who don't look at chapter 11 as being written by Daniel at all. But there's a problem with all this, and that is in 1947 there was a find. A Bedouin shepherd found scrolls in clay pots in caves in a place called Qumran. And you may know that those scrolls are what we call today the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls date from before, in some cases, before some of the events were to occur that Daniel mentions, and occur after. So almost up to 200 years BC, up to 150 AD. And because of that, what you find is what they had in their scrolls are identical to what you have in Daniel, showing that what Daniel wrote is what he wrote long before. There was no possibility for a forgery. Other proofs have come this way as well, but for us as Bible students, as Bible readers and Bible-believing Christians, we can be rest assured and be confident that what Daniel wrote in Daniel 11 is authentic prophecy, but it's going to be very specific, and all the facts you'll learn in our short time today is going to really give you a push towards history and understanding of what was going on in the Persian Empire before Alexander the Great, and then what was happening after Alexander the Great, and what was going on. And all of the facts I'm going to tell you have been proven by historians, whether you are a conservative scholar, a liberal scholar, whether you're an atheist scholar, whether you're a Christian scholar, a theist, whatever you may be, they all agree that all the kings we mentioned are people who really lived, and this prophecy has been fulfilled. Now, parts of chapter 11 are not fulfilled. As I said before, this is going to be leading us from the panorama of the time of the Persian kings all the way to the time of the tribulation and even after. And so Israel is going to have a part in this. And that is why Daniel from chapter 10 has been receiving, or I should say being prepared to receive what God is going to be teaching him in regards to his people, the Jews, and their return back to Israel, and then what the people will have to go through. And this is very important because Daniel in many ways believed, he thought, he felt that the 70 years of captivity was all there needed to be. That after the 70 years of judgment that God had laid upon Judah and Israel, what was going to happen is the house of Israel, the entire inhabitants of Judah and Israel, they were going to pay the price of captivity for the sins of the nation, for not letting the land rest, and so forth. And because of their idolatry, because of their sins, that 70-year time was set up. And as you know, Daniel read Jeremiah and learned that God determined by his sovereignty that there would be a time, that there would be a length of time, 70 years of captivity. But in Daniel's heart, he thought that was all there was. What is going to be revealed here is that the oppression, the suppression, and the pain and even suffering that Israel is going to go through is not going to stop. It will continue through Gentile history and continue all the way until the establishment of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. The Jews are going to be going through a suffering. It's not going to come to an end. And therefore, Daniel is being prepared for what is going to be happening. Now, as we read these verses today, you're going to think to yourself, well, Israel isn't mentioned very, very much. And here's what I want to tell you. As we look at these verses, you're going to learn that Israel is not mentioned, but the Gentile kings and armies and warrings all happen on Israel's territory, their soil, their land. It's trampled, as you can imagine, trampled under the Gentiles, so to speak. That's what's being happening here. So you see Israel right in the middle of it all. Okay, now, with all that said, let's begin. Verse 1, we'll take one verse at a time. There'll be explanation for it. And maybe as we go a little further, we'll discover that we may not have to do just one verse. We'll do a few. But you're going to have to stay with me a little bit on this because I'm going to be explaining who these people are. All you're going to read is a king, someone. You're not going to hear names. I'm going to have to tell you who the names are so you'll understand, okay, here's a name. Here's a king. Here's a leader. Here's what they're doing. Here's what's going on. All right. Daniel chapter 11, verse 1. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now, that has no meaning, it seems like, in verse 1. So I had to explain to you what it means from chapter 10. If most of your Bibles, sometimes you'll have that there'll be headings in certain chapters, like each chapter will have a particular heading. When you get to chapter 11 of Daniel, there tends to be no heading there. The reason why is because Daniel 11 is continuing the thought of chapter 10. The relationship between the angel that is comforting Daniel after his vision of Jesus Christ in glory is now continuing what the revelation's going to be. And so if we go back to chapter 10, just to the last verse of chapter 10, if we go to actually the last two verses, verses 20 and 21, let me read to you what it says there, and then I'll continue reading into chapter 11, verse 1. Then he said, "Do you know why I have come to you?" The angel is speaking to Daniel. "And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael your prince. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him." Okay, we talked a lot about this. I'm going to touch on it right now. All of the nations of the world, all of the empires of the world, every one of us, all of mankind, just to put it in a short phrase, are in a spiritual battle. And even whether we know it or not, there's a spiritual battle going on all around us. There are demonic beings and angelic beings at war. And we are the prize. And what is happening is that through the history of the world, there are empires that are whispered and governed by demonic forces. That's what we learned last time about the Prince of Persia. It is a demonic demon that is controlling the affairs of a particular empire with the plan and the desire to try to fight against the will of God. God in his sovereignty, God in his good pleasure has created angels that do his bidding. God doesn't need them. He just created them out of his good pleasure, just as God has created us out of his good pleasure, and he has angels that are doing his will. And so in the spiritual realm, which we do not see in the physical, there is warring happening. And in chapter 10, Daniel learned that the reason why the answer to his prayer was so long, 21 days, 3 weeks, was because there was a war going on, a battle specifically between an angel and a demon, in this case, the Prince of Persia. And this was holding back the answer. And then Michael came and helped the angel to then provide the answer coming to Daniel. And the angel is saying to Daniel, I have to give you the vision, the revelation, but I have to go back and I have to fight that demon again so that I can then have an influence upon Persia, the empire of Persia. Now, why would that be? Well, as you look at history, you'll know that King Cyrus did offer the decree, did he not, for the Jews to go back to Israel. That was a good thing. But what we're learning is that that decree created a spiritual war in which the demonic realm was fighting against the angelic realm and trying to hinder that actual migration back to the homeland for the Jews. So the angel tells Daniel, I have to go back to fight, but I have to tell you something else, Daniel, that when I fight the Prince of Persia and when I defeat him, I have to tell you there's another demon coming. Oh, who's that? Well, it's going to be the one from Greece. That was the end of chapter 10. So this is an ongoing battle, constant battle that's going on behind the scenes. Imagine your life. Imagine my life. Imagine the history of the world being on a stage. And what we see is what's on the stage, but what you don't see is what's behind the scenes. The curtain is drawn for the background props, the people in the back pulling the string, so to speak, pulling the ropes, providing all the background and the different things that make a play or a musical happen. You don't see what's happening there, but that's what we're getting insight into, is what's going on behind the back curtain of the stage of life. Great, incredible insights that Daniel is giving to us. So what he means by verse 1 is the angel's still speaking, and he's saying, I, even I, strengthened. Now he says over here specifically that I, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now the him could refer to Darius the king, Cyrus, the same man. It could be, or it could be that the angel was strengthening Michael, because the subject before Darius is referring to Michael. And right now it's one or the other. Either it's a contending to help Michael in his spiritual battle in the angelic realm, or it's the helping of Darius the king and helping him become a king that's influenced for the good and not for the evil. Now, this little fact alone is just setting a stage and kind of transitioning us into chapter 11. As a musician, I'm very keen on the importance of transitions. As a music instructor, as I have taught hundreds of students over the years, I have always made it very clear that one of the most important elements of being a good instructor and helping students play music better is for them to learn transitions. It's one thing to learn notes. It's one thing to learn the chords. It's one thing to even learn the melody, but to go between idea to idea, motif to motif, theme to theme, transitioning into different sections is very important. And that doesn't just stay in music, that carries over into the world of the Bible. So we have now transitioned into chapter 11. Now we begin verse 2. And here we go. So get ready. If you are a note taker, I recommend you get some notes out or some paper out to write some notes, because you'll need to stay on track on what's happening here. Let me tell you that in this section of chapter 11, not all of it, this section, we're covering about 200 years of history. Okay, 200 years of history is going to be covered in this time frame here. Not all of chapter 11, just in the time frame. So verse 2, and now the angel speaks, and now I will tell you the truth. As if he wasn't going to, but he's going to tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. So now Daniel's getting some real information. There are coming 3 kings. Well, there's a king now. This one doesn't count. These are kings that are coming in the future. There are 3 of them. But there's going to be one more. I'll kind of put it from your perspective so you can see it better. There's going to be another guy rising up, and this 4th king is going to be greater, wealthier, and greater than any of the 3 kings. And he will have power, and he's going to stir up anger in his heart towards Greece. What that means is this 4th king is going to attack Greece. Who are these kings? Good question. The first king we need to know, let you know about, and by the way, historians are all in agreement on this. There is no debate about these kings. The first king is a king by the name of Cambyses. That is C-A-M-B-Y-S-E-S. Cambyses, or Cambyses. You can say Cambyses if you want, with a C-A-M. He's the first king mentioned. The second king mentioned is a king by the name of Pseudo-Smyrtus. You say Pseudo-Smyrtus. Now, Pseudo-Smyrtus was an imposter. He was a fake, but he looked so much like Cambyses that he actually was somehow able to control and galvanize. And at some point, right when Cambyses either died or before, he was able to ascend into power. He didn't rule very long, very, very long at all. 1 year is his reign. Then the third king, his name is Darius the First, and then Hystostapes. Okay, so it's think of histopes, or so Hysta, just in case you want to read it, Hystaspes. Darius the First, Hystopses. For 521 to 486 was his reign. Those were the three kings. Now comes the king that's going to come above them. He'll come after. And these are successional kings. And this king, all kings of Persia, by the way, all kings of Persia. And the next king will be Xerxes the First. Not Artaxerxes, but Xerxes the First. Xerxes the First. He is reigning from 486, about 486 to about 465 BC. And this is the king that's being mentioned here in this chapter. And I'm going to read to you just what this king is about. So it says here, and the fourth king shall be far richer than them all. Who? All the other three kings. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up against the realm of Greece. So he decides he wants to attack Greece, and he will attack Greece, as a matter of fact. And when he attacks Greece, he actually loses. Just want to let you know, he doesn't win. But the Greeks remember him, because Xerxes the First was considered one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. Xerxes I amassed a gargantuan army to go against Greece, but he did not succeed. 150 years later, Greece decides to come back and retaliate. Even though they defeated him in battle, they want to finish the job. In other words, to conquer and destroy Persia completely. 150 years later, and the enemy in their mind, who's been long dead, is Xerxes the First. Now, if you know your Bible well, he's also known as another leader. He has another name, another pseudonym, Xerxes the First, and the other name that he has is, if I can pronounce this right, Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. Now, if you've read the book of Esther, he is the king in that book. So Ahasuerus is the king, and he is actually ruling and reigning. And this is the king. So he's not only mentioned by Daniel, he is also king reigning during the time of Esther. Okay? Now, with all that said, that gives you an idea. He attacks Greece. He loses the battle, but because he was such a vicious ruler, such a how can I put this? A ruler that had effects and was able to be effective in his strategic attacks against Greece, they remembered him. There are a succession of kings that come after Xerxes I that history does not really care too much about. They're known, but they're not even biblically mentioned at all. It turns out that 150 years later, the Greeks come back and they attack because they want to destroy the memory of this particular leader. Now, when they come back to attack 150 years later, who is the leader of Greece at that time? I'm sure you may know if you have studied with me and been with us in our Daniel studies. And if you thought to yourself, it's got to be Alexander the Great, you would be correct. So, in chapter 11, we have a focus on several kings. The leader of the first group, that is, there's three kings and there's one that's greater, the fourth king. That's the first of the important kings of Daniel 11. Though I mentioned you Cambyses, though I mentioned Pseudosmerdis or Darius the First, those particular three kings are not substantial. They're mentioned because there are three kings, but the one that overpowered in riches and in military might was Xerxes. So put in your mind that Xerxes the First is the first important king of chapter 11. The second important king of chapter 11 is what begins our next verse. So if we read from verse 4, here's what we have. And when he has arisen, I'll begin verse 3, forgive me. Then a mighty king shall arise. This is after Xerxes attacks Greece. Verse 3 is 150 years has passed, and now we got verse 3. There Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Now, who is this king that Daniel is prophesying about? Remember, all these kings that I'm mentioning to you are not even born yet. They're not even born yet. So Cambyses is not even alive yet. No one's alive yet. They're all not even there. So whether it be Cambyses, whether it be Smerdis, whether it be Darius I, whether it be Xerxes, they're not even alive. And then we have this other king who comes out of nowhere, and it is Alexander the Great. And we now find specific detail about him. Now, you may remember in our previous studies in Daniel, we talked about Alexander the Great. He's mentioned, absolutely he is. So we already know that he is the belly of bronze. Okay, we already know that, the thighs and the belly. That is part of the image of Daniel 2. Well, he's also mentioned here. He's also mentioned Daniel 7. But in here it says this, and we have to go really specific here because you're going to read this and not understand it. And I will tell you, we have to go through each of these verses really carefully because it doesn't make sense if you don't know the history a little bit. So here it says, then a mighty king shall arise, Alexander the Great. Just know that that verse represents him. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these. Now, if you just read that, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what's the Bible saying here? What does it actually mean? Well, you're in good hands. Let me help you. What's being said in these two verses here is basically the panorama of Alexander the Great. It's his life in a few verses. He comes to power. We already know that. But then it says right here, and when he has arisen, that means when he comes to the point where he's now the world ruler. And if you know history, he is arguably the greatest military leader in the history of the world. He conquered from Europe to India. And he did it in a matter of 7 to 11 years. And he was like in his early 30s when he died of a drunken stupor in Babylon. Alexander the Great, as we all know, wept when he conquered the known world because, as we all know, he realized there are no more worlds to conquer. No one has ever done what Alexander the Great's done. Napoleon went and he conquered the Middle East, and he went even to Africa, and he wanted to do what Alexander the Great did, and he did not accomplish it. Alexander the Great is unique in the annals of history. And what it says here is what Daniel's being told by the angel about this future man. He's being told that when he has arisen, it says his kingdom shall be broken. Now, how is his kingdom broken? It's broken because of his death. Now, when he dies, so when Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is broken. Well, broken into what? It's broken into, as it says right here, into the four winds of heaven. What that means is that the kingdom of Greece breaks up into four different directions: east, west, north, and south. Literally, that's what happened. And those four winds are not literally winds, they represent men, which we all know historically are the four generals that took over the Grecian Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. It took many years, by the way. This did not happen like next month. When Alexander the Great died, there was a war within Greece, infighting within Greece, to see who would rise to the top to become the next leader. Now, there's some other insight about Alexander the Great you need to know in the next words that are said here. We'll talk more about the four winds in a moment, because that's going to carry our thought through our study. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven. But, listen and read very carefully, but not among his posterity. What does that mean? That means his kingdom, Alexander the Great's kingdom, will not go to his family. Why is that? Well, Alexander the Great had a half-brother who was retarded. Sounds sad, I know. He had that. He also had a baby that was born after he died. There was one that gave pregnant that he died. And then he also had an illegitimate son. All three of these people, his half-brother, his illegitimate son, and the baby born posthumously, that was after his death, were all murdered. Therefore, everything doing with his family was cut off. And what Daniel is being prophesied to is he's being shown and revealed this information that this leader will not have any family who will be able to ascend to the throne and be able to then carry on his legacy. Hence why it was broken up into the four winds. There's another nuance you need to know. Let's keep reading. Then it says here, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. What that means is when the kingdom of Greece is broken up into the four different winds, the four different generals and the different regions of the Grecian Empire, none of those regions will have the dominance. None of them will have the power that Greece had under Alexander. So Alexander, as leader of Greece, that power is never to be known again. They will break up into four different empires. Those empires will have power, but they will never rule in any dominion or in the equal power that Greece had under Alexander. And it says, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these, meaning his kingdom is going to be broken up and that it will be given to others. Okay, so now we've learned the second big king. We got the first one, Xerxes the First. He attacks Greece. He loses that battle. 150 years passes. Alexander comes, and then he controls the world, the known world. But at the height of his powers, what happens? He dies. Kingdom's broken up, divided by his four generals. None of his family survive. Therefore, there's no family legacy. There's no carrying down of that posterity for leadership. And those four broken up sections of Greece will never have the power they had together collectively under Alexander. Okay, I hope you got that. Let's continue now. All right, verse 5. We're moving along nicely. I think we're doing okay here. There's a lot of stuff here. Also, now, okay, before I get to verse 5, because I'll read it, but I have to give it to you and explain it because it assumes something. Verse 5, also, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Well, what is Daniel talking about here? We just got through the tsunami of Greece. We figured that out. Now, what's happening here? Well, what's happening here is you need to learn or need to know about the different kingdoms or the different generals. Now, if you've been with us since Daniel 7, you'll know this. But for those who may want a refresher on this, we need to know what this is. So, when Greece broke up, four sections, the four winds, that is the four directions on the earth, you find that you have general number 1, Cassander. He takes over Macedonia. It's to the north. Then you have Lysimachus. Lysimachus takes over Thrace and Asia Minor to the east. If that's east to you, I think. I'm not sure. I think it is. It's my west. And then from there, you have Seleucus, who takes over Syria. Now, in perspective of Israel, it is north of Israel. So keep that in mind. So you have Cassander, Macedonia. You have Lysimachus in Thrace and Asia Minor. You have Seleucus, the third general, in Syria. And then you have Ptolemy in Africa, or Egypt, Africa. So what we're going to focus on is that in these verses going forward, from verse 5 on, Daniel is concerned with only 2 of the 4 generals. Only 2 of the 4 generals. Not Lysimachus, not Cassander. only the generals that are north and south of the land of Israel. Because between those two kings and their dynasties, they're going to be warring against each other. And the battlefield, the place they tend to meet, is going to be Israel. So, as we go farther, I want you to know the king of the south is Ptolemy. Notice that the king of the south will be Ptolemy. That is, he's the king of Egypt. Okay. The king of the north will be Seleucus. Now, remember, when we talk about the term Ptolemy and we talk about the word Seleucus, these are become dynasty names. So though we may mention the king or mention the name Ptolemy, it's not always going to be the same Ptolemy. It'll be the leader that's ruling that area, that region at the time. Okay? All right. So let's inch our way a little further in here and see if we can get a couple more verses before we end today, just to kind of get us moving through chapter 11 a little bit. Okay, so what we have verse 5 saying this: also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes. Now, what that means is this king, Ptolemy, this general, his dynasty, his empire in the south will be strong as a prince of Alexander was. So the princes of Alexander were the leaders of Alexander's empire, and to be equal in power in that respect, Ptolemy's power grows. That's what he's basically saying. And then it says here, his dominion shall be a great dominion. That is, Ptolemy's dominion will be great. He's in the south. Verse 6, and at the end of some years, so time has passed, they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. Wow, what does that mean? I'll make it very simple. The word you probably should have caught was the word daughter. Did you catch that? If you caught the term daughter, you're in great shape. Let's make it very simple. I'm going to make it so simple for you. Here's the issue. There are two dynasties. There's the Seleucid dynasty in the north and the Ptolemaic dynasty in the south. Years have passed. The king of the south at this point in verse 6, what his name is Ptolemy II Philadelphia. That's Philadelphes, like the word Philadelphia. And that means brotherly love, by the way. Phileo is love in Greek. Adelphos is brother in Greek. So it's brotherly love. And doesn't mean he was a nice guy. It just means that was his name. So therefore, Ptolemy II, Philadelphia. So we have that. And then at the top, you have Antiochus II, Theos. Theos means God in Greek. And that's a pretty arrogant name to have. I would not want to name yourself that, but he did. So in this case, Antiochus II, Theos, is ruling in the north. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, is ruling in the south. Now, what happens is Ptolemy in the south wants to maintain control a little bit with the north. He wants to basically tell the king of the Seleucid dynasty, we are going to have an alliance. And here's what you're going to do. You're going to marry my daughter. And that daughter is going to be going to the north to marry Antiochus II Theos. Okay? Sounds good. But there's a problem. The way that we look at the verses here, and I won't need to read it again, I'm just going to tell you what verse 6 means. What happens is that the king of the north, that is the Seleucid dynasty king, Antiochus II Theos, he is already married. So Ptolemy, who's more powerful at this time, at this point, Ptolemy is more powerful. He tells the Seleucid king, divorce your wife. Now, his wife's name was Laodicea, or Laodice is another way of saying it. And we know that name if you know the book of Revelation. Laodice or Laodicea would be her name. The daughter's name is Bernice. And Bernice, Ptolemy's daughter, is sent up north to marry Antiochus II Theos, and Antiochus himself has to divorce his wife, Laodice. Okay? Now, Ptolemy requires this. Why? Because you know, if you study history, that alliances are usually made by blood in the past. Actually, as a matter of fact, if you go back as recent as World War I, people don't realize that most of the kings and princes and czars of the countries that were in World War I were all related. I don't know if you know that. Nicholas Romanov was related to the kings of England, just as Germany had relations with England. They were all related. It was like inbred, weird stuff. That's why if you look at pictures of many of these rulers back in those days, over 100 years ago, there's a lot of similarity in their look. So this concept of marrying and bringing someone from another king to marry another is common. It's been going on for millennia. So this was what happened there. But here's the problem. The problem is Ptolemy dies. Bernice's father dies. This is what's said here in the text. Actually, we learn this fact in the text, and this is all hundreds of years before it's supposed to happen. This goes on. And so here's what we find. Here's what we see. It says here, but she, the daughter, shall be given up with those who brought her and with him who begot her. That's her father. And with him who stretched or strengthened her in those times. The person who strengthens her is the one that she marries. So what happened here? What verse 6 is saying to us is that something dreadful happened. Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy, ends up being murdered. Antiochus, the one who married her, ends up being murdered. Ptolemy dies first. That's what happens first. After his death, why did Bernice get married? Why did Antiochus die? Well, here's what happened. Antiochus, remember, divorced his first wife, Laodice. She wasn't very happy about the divorce, ladies and gentlemen. She was upset about that. Well, he takes her back as his wife. And when she becomes his wife again, she enacts vengeance against the daughter of Ptolemy, who is replacing her as her husband's wife. She kills her. She kills all of her attendants that came from Egypt up to Syria, and she poisons Antiochus II Theos, her husband. That's what happens, and that's what's happening in this verse here. It's a lot going on, I know, but that's what we learn in the text here. So the person who strengthened her is cut off. The person who begot her is no longer there. And then those who came up with her, as verse 6 says, are all gone. Now verse 7. But, the word but's a good one. But from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. Now, who is this? This refers ultimately to the brother of Bernice. From the root of Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy, apparently Ptolemy had a son. And this son gets really mad. Why? His daughter's been murdered. I'm sorry, his sister's been murdered. Forgive me. And therefore he galvanizes an army and he goes through Israel up to the north and he conquers. He comes to do away with the Seleucid army. Now, what I want to do is I want to stop right there for this week because we're all leading somewhere here. There's a little action that has to be done here. There's something that's going to lead to a character you already know about through history. I'll explain about that next time. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how all this leads to another man named Antiochus the Great. Antiochus the Great is going to be the focus because what's going to happen is we're also going to learn about the man who comes as or like the Antichrist. The point of all of this that we're learning, why are we learning this? Why is Daniel being given this information? Why is he being shared all this information? Well, it's very simple. He's being shared the information because we are to know, we are to understand that God knows all things, that God ordains all things. It's impossible to think that if you look at history, God knows all things that are going to happen and he ordains all things that are going to happen. And you would be a fool not to think that that's the case. And we're being revealed here that everything that's in the text is showing us that God is in control of the affairs of the future. And he is in control of the affairs of the future. And we, you and I, look back at the past and go, wait a minute here. This Bible, written, that is, the different books of the Bible, written when they were, and this particular book written in the 6th century BC, we're now learning, we're now understanding that, wait a minute here, this is something that was prophesied hundreds of years before it happened, and then it happened, is to then give us confidence, is to give us galvanize our walk with him and our strength to know that what God has said, he has said. What will happen is what will happen. But there's also another point, and that is going to lead us to knowing the activities and the actions of the Antichrist. When you read Revelation, we learn about the Antichrist. Well, he's not called that, of course. He's called the beast in Revelation. Paul knows him by other names. In Daniel, of course, he is the little horn that grows, and many other names. The thing about, though, is that we're going to learn about his actual campaign, his actual actions, his actual military movements. And that's what we're learning here between these warring kings, the kings of the north, the Seleucids, and the kings of the south, the Ptolemaic kings. And when we talk about one particular character, Antiochus Epiphanes, who came in and desecrated the temple in Israel, that was a Seleucid king. And a king who was wanting to come in the stead and to destroy and to defame and to blaspheme God. Well, that act is going to foreshadow the act of another man in the future, who will be the Antichrist, who will do the same exact thing. And that's what we're going to learn about as well as we go further. So our movement is moving through time, going further and further, closer to where we get to the kingdom. Now, I need to tell you, though, after we finish with the Persian kings, after we finish with the 4 generals and these warring kings, we then jump into the future from our perspective to the tribulation time. And that is going to be another part of where chapter 11 and chapter 12 begins with that section there. So if you would, I'd recommend something. Read ahead and just read the rest of chapter 11. And then we get back next week. We're hoping to get through most of it. We'll try to get through the rest of chapter 11. We'll try. But it will be good that you know what we talked about today. So there are some kings in 11 you need to know. The first major king, Xerxes I. The second king, Alexander the Great. Those are the first 2 major kings you need to know about. And then we're going to come to Antiochus the Great. He's coming next. Okay. All right. I hope that will help you and bless you this week as you go through your study. Very detailed today, I know. And I think I kind of didn't go. I went longer than I thought I wanted to go today, but that's okay. I hope that you are blessed by it. All right. Let's close in prayer. Father, we come before you. We thank you for this moment, this time where we could get into your word and just study your word, your prophecies, and your future statements to us that we would read for the purpose of understanding, and by understanding that we would know your heart and your will for the future. I pray, Lord, that you would bless all those that were with me today and that got through these verses. I pray that you bring back to remembrance everything that was stated. And I pray, Lord, that you would not have them overwhelmed, but that your Spirit would speak through them in these texts and that they would be blessed by it. So, Father, we thank you for this time. Bless all those who have needs or unspoken or that no one knows. I pray that you would touch everyone watching, everyone listening, and that your loving hand of grace and mercy would be with everyone today and this week. And we give this all to you in Jesus' name. Amen.